Julia and Max marked their 20th wedding anniversary this year. Their life together, while steady and reliable, had fallen into a rhythm that was anything but thrilling, familiar, ordinary, even a little mechanical. Living under the same roof was their daughter, Kate, who had just kicked off her second year at university. Julia and Max brimmed with pride over Kate's independence. She'd earned a fully funded spot in a competitive program all on her own and crushed her first year with flying colors. Despite working at the same university as a lecturer, Julia never once tried to pull strings or offer Kate a leg up. Among Kate's classmates was Mark, a smooth-talking, self-assured young man who carried himself with an air of confidence that seemed far older than his years. He had a natural magnetism, the kind that didn't go unnoticed by the girls in class, and, unexpectedly, not even by Julia herself. The age gap was significant, but something about him had a way of drawing people in. For all his charm, though, Mark wasn't exactly a standout academically. After handing in a paper that was less than impressive in Julia's course, he made his way to her desk once class had cleared out. Kate waited for him down the hallway, unaware. With a tilt of his head and a motion toward the door, Mark asked if they could speak alone. He stepped back, letting the door swing shut behind him. As Julia gathered her papers, she glanced up and asked if something was wrong. She vaguely recalled his submission oversimplified and lacking depth and gently urged him to push himself harder next time. But then, as Mark stepped in closer, a little too close for comfort, her words caught in her throat. There was something in his look, in the way he moved into her space, that sent a flicker of unease down her spine, and yet, oddly, something else too. A blush crept across her cheeks before she could suppress it. The unspoken tension hung thick in the air. There was an easy confidence about him, something attractive and disarming. With a slight smug smile, Mark turned to leave, and Julia, feeling her face flush, instinctively lowered her gaze. As he slung his bag over his shoulder and headed for the door, he threw one last sentence at her: "Julia, don't underestimate my capabilities." For days after, the memory of that strange, fleeting moment clung to Julia like mist that wouldn't lift. She felt unsettled, a little ashamed and, to her surprise, stirred in a way she hadn't felt in years. It reminded her of how things used to be at the start of her marriage, when every glance from Max made her pulse quicken. Now, things were different. Their marriage was built on routine, a calm, unspoken pact of familiarity. While Julia appreciated the solid ground they stood on, she couldn't help but wonder if habit was the only thing holding it all together. 2 weeks had slipped by since her encounter with Mark. In that time, his behavior remained unpredictable, sometimes keeping his distance, other times shooting her glances that sent her mind spiraling. The shift in him made her second-guess herself. Why did this student have such a grip on her thoughts? And worse, why did part of her want to understand how he saw her? Somewhere along the way, she'd begun imagining their connection as something that went beyond the boundaries of the classroom. At their next seminar, Julia stumbled mid-sentence, thrown off by the mere presence of him. Her thoughts had drifted again, and it showed. Mark, sensing the reason for her sudden pause, slid into his seat with a knowing smirk tugging at his lips. When the lesson wrapped and students gathered their things, Julia found herself blurting out something unexpected. "Mark, can you stay back for a moment?" She was stunned by her own voice. He smiled, calm, confident, and settled into his chair. Julia stayed where she was, fully aware now that he had no intention of making the first move. So she crossed the room. "Have you given it any thought?" he asked, turning to face her directly. "Thought to what?" she replied, not following. "To what I'm capable of," he said, his voice low, his hands already gliding boldly across her thighs. That encounter was their last, at least, within the confines of the classroom. Both of them knew there would be no more meetings behind desks and doors. Julia, heart pounding, quietly slid the lock into place and let herself fall into the moment, no longer resisting what she could no longer deny. Their covert romance had been simmering for about a month. Whenever a long break rolled around, they'd go hunting for an empty office, or sometimes they'd sneak off together after lectures wrapped up. Outside the university walls, though, they were strangers. Julia had zero intention of making their relationship public, especially since she was a married woman and a teacher, no less. But Mark? He wanted more. He kept pushing her to leave her husband, convinced she didn't love him anymore. Why else would she be spending her time elsewhere? Anytime he brought it up, Julia would hurriedly button her dress and mutter something about pressing errands. But Mark wouldn't let it go. He was nothing if not persistent. Lately, he'd noticed Julia's daughter, Kate, showing more interest in him than usual, and this time, he decided to use that to his advantage. Pretending he was eager to strike up a friendship, he casually asked Kate if he could swing by after an evening stroll. The girl, eager and unsuspecting, said yes and invited him over for dinner without so much as a word to her parents. When Julia stepped into the hallway to greet her daughter, she froze. There he was, her young lover, standing right there in her home. The sight hit her like a slap. Not even in her darkest dreams had she imagined something so outrageous. Mark's eyes met hers with a sly gleam, filled with a bold, unspoken desire. Dinner that night was unbearable. Julia barely spoke, her stomach in knots. The whole time, she silently begged that Mark wouldn't slip up, wouldn't say something that gave them away. Thankfully, he played it smart, carefully choosing his words, keeping a tight lid on any gestures that might raise suspicion. It was clear he was trying to send her a message. He was serious. Kate seemed serious too. She'd fallen for her handsome classmate, hopelessly smitten. But he only saw her as a convenient distraction, keeping up his affair with her mother the whole time. A few days later, after yet another secret meeting behind a locked office door, Mark circled back to the same old conversation, asking Julia once again to leave her family. The word struck a nerve. Her chest tightened with a pang she couldn't quite name. The double life, the constant lies, it was all catching up to her. That's it. I've had it with you. Either you learn to appreciate what we have right now or we're done. Julia snapped, snatching her skirt out from under him, her voice trembling with frustration. Mark, in his usual stormy fashion, flew out of the room, his pride bruised. How dare she speak to him that way? Oh, she'd regret it, he'd make sure of that. His first act of vengeance? He turned his attention to Kate. With fake sincerity, he confessed that he'd been harboring feelings for her all along. The girl, already in over her head, was swept off her feet. She'd wanted him for so long. She couldn't believe her luck. Julia found out about it a week later. Her daughter's studies had clearly taken a back seat, and the signs were too obvious to ignore. Kate and Mark had started skipping lectures together, and Julia, staring at the pattern forming before her eyes, could no longer look away. Jealousy twisted inside her, unexpected and sharp. But there was pity, too. Poor Kate. Julia could see it so clearly. Mark was using her, playing on her emotions like a fiddle. She messaged him, pleaded, really, to stop leading her daughter on. But the next day, things took a turn for the worse. That morning, she walked into the classroom, distracted, lost in her thoughts. She went straight to her desk to drop off her books, and that's when she saw them. The sideways glances. The smirks. The weird hush. And then she spotted it. On the blackboard, scrawled in bright red marker, were the words, "Do you like it younger?" She went pale. A chill ran through her. Snatching a rag, she erased the message in frantic strokes. Then she spun around to face the students. Her gaze swept the room, and she noticed immediately Kate wasn't there. Whispers buzzed from desk to desk. A few giggles here and there. Her mind raced. It was him. He'd told someone. Maybe everyone. As soon as the class ended, Julia crammed her books into her bag and rushed into the hall, scanning the crowd for Kate. She spotted her by the window, standing with a friend, eyes dull and downcast. Julia rushed toward her, desperate to get a read on what her daughter knew, to say something, anything. But Kate saw her first and bolted, too humiliated to face her own mother. She'd heard the rumors too. Poor thing, Julia whispered to herself. Then she turned and walked home alone, pulling out her phone again and again, dialing Mark's number over and over, trying to figure out just how far he'd gone. Not long after, Kate burst into the apartment. Julia stepped forward, arms outstretched, ready to hold her, but the girl sidestepped the gesture like it burned. "I heard everything. What the hell is going on?" she cried, storming past her mother, voice trembling with betrayal. At that moment, Max appeared in the doorway, still glued to his phone. Slowly, he looked up, his expression unreadable, his gaze flicking between wife and daughter. "Kate," he said softly, "can you give us a moment? Your mom and I need to talk." But Kate didn't budge. Instead, she glanced down at the phone in his hand, her instincts kicking in. Without warning, she lunged forward and snatched it away. A heartbeat later, she let out a horrified gasp. Covering her mouth with one hand, she stared at the screen in disbelief, then let the phone slip from her fingers. It clattered to the floor, face up. On it was a photo Mark had sent, him and Julia, tangled up together in the office. Kate didn't say a word. She turned and fled, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the walls. Max didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the fallen phone, his voice cold and stripped of any warmth. "I think you should leave," he said. Julia couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. She stood frozen, like a statue carved from grief, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. It was as if the ground had cracked open beneath her feet. In a single evening, the life she'd known solid, predictable, whole was gone. Max, once the kind-hearted, adoring husband, now looked at her like a stranger. Cold. Unforgiving. The divorce happened quickly. No drawn-out fights. No second chances. Just silence. Neither Max nor Kate reached out. Neither wanted to see her, hear her voice, or offer a shred of comfort. The only thing Julia had left, the only space where she still felt like herself, was her job. Thankfully, word of her affair with Mark hadn't climbed the chain of command. The higher-up stayed blissfully unaware, and she was able to keep her position. But the atmosphere had changed. Every time she stepped onto campus, she felt the air shift, her skin crawling with dread. Would today bring a new rumor? Another slip-up? A fresh humiliation? Oddly enough, Mark backed off. His hunger for revenge seemed to dull, replaced by a smug sort of peace. With Max and Kate out of the way, nothing stood between him and Julia, or so he thought. In the mess of it all, Julia found herself drifting back to him. She was broken, ashamed, desperate for anything that might ease the ache. Mark offered her comfort, brief, familiar, and fleeting. Their affair reignited. But the fire had changed. It no longer warmed her, it just kept her from freezing completely. Still, the doubts crept in. Could this really last? Could something so tainted, so deeply flawed, ever become real? Mark's interest waned. His eyes began to wander. There was someone else now, a girl his own age, someone with no baggage, no scandal. Julia saw it coming, felt it in the way he touched her less, spoke in half-sentences, and started disappearing without excuses. When he finally drifted away for good, she was left with nothing but silence. The brief illusion of love had vanished, leaving her exposed to the full weight of what she'd lost. The affair had been a distraction, a reckless attempt to escape from a life that had started to feel too small. But now there was no hiding, no distraction, only the echo of her own choices. Regret seeped into every corner of her being. What had she done? She had crossed a line with a student, thrown away years of marriage, shattered her daughter's trust. And for what? But guilt, no matter how sharp, couldn't rewrite the past. What was broken stayed broken. And Julia, once the pillar of her little world, now stood alone in its ruins.